The unforgiving Egyptian sun baked the ancient sands of Menacamp, where thousands of young Australian volunteers gathered in the early months of 1915. They had answered the call of the British Empire with profound enthusiasm, viewing the impending conflict as a grand, heroic adventure rather than a brutal reality. Sergeant Thomas Miller, a pragmatic man with weathered features and a stern demeanor, watched his platoon struggle through grueling infantry drills. "Keep your rifles elevated and your steps synchronized," Miller barked, knowing their naive optimism would soon be shattered by the harsh, unforgiving mechanics of modern industrial warfare. These men represented a new nation, eager to prove their worth on the global stage alongside the established imperial powers. However, beneath their cheerful exterior lay a profound inexperience regarding the terrifying capabilities of 20th century weaponry. Miller relentlessly pushed them through mock charges and bayonet practices, attempting to forge a disciplined military unit from this collection of clerks, farmers, and laborers. He understood that survival required more than raw courage. It demanded absolute cohesion and an instinctual reliance on the man standing beside you. The men grumbled about the heat, but they respected Miller's relentless, unyielding pursuit of excellence. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away in London, the strategic architects of the British Empire finalized a daring amphibious operation. The objective was to force a passage through the heavily fortified Dardanelles Strait, capture the Ottoman capital of Constantinople, and secure a vital maritime supply route to their Russian allies. This ambitious geopolitical maneuver aimed to swiftly knock the Ottoman Empire out of the conflict and bypass the bloody, static stalemate currently paralyzing the Western Front. Major General William Bridges, commanding the 1st Australian Division, studied the operational maps with a mixture of professional determination and quiet, underlying apprehension. General Bridges knew his relatively untested division would form the crucial spearhead of this unprecedented military undertaking. The plan required a complex, synchronized amphibious landing on a hostile shore, a tactical maneuver fraught with immense logistical and operational perils. He spent endless hours coordinating with British naval commanders, trying to ensure sufficient transport, artillery support, and medical facilities for the impending assault. Despite the optimistic projections from high command, Bridges recognized the inherent dangers of projecting military power onto a heavily defended peninsula with limited intelligence regarding the specific topography and the true strength of the entrenched enemy forces. In early April, the sprawling encampments in Egypt were finally dismantled as the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps received their deployment orders. The troops boarded a massive flotilla of transport ships, leaving the sweltering desert behind for the staging area at Lemnos, a Greek island situated perilously close to the operational target. The sheer scale of the assembled naval armada was a breathtaking testament to the industrial might and logistical reach of the British Empire. Battleships, cruisers, and countless troopships crowded the vast natural harbor of Mudros, creating an atmosphere of intense anticipation and monumental historical significance. Aboard the crowded transport vessels, the men of Sergeant Miller's platoon spent their days meticulously cleaning their weapons and sharpening their bayonets. The initial excitement of their departure gradually morphed into a tense, contemplative silence as the reality of their destination became increasingly clear. They attended final briefings, studying crude maps of the Gallipoli Peninsula, a rugged, mountainous landmass that would soon become their battlefield. Miller walked among his men, offering quiet words of encouragement and practical advice regarding ammunition conservation and battlefield communication. "Stay low, keep moving forward, and trust your training," he repeated with calm authority. The strategic brilliance of the naval campaign had already been severely compromised by a failed Anglo-French naval assault on the Dardanelles in March. This prior engagement had explicitly warned the Ottoman defenders of the impending Allied invasion, allowing them crucial weeks to heavily fortify the peninsula with intricate trench networks, concealed machine gun nests, and extensive barbed wire entanglements. The element of operational surprise, a vital component of any successful amphibious landing, had been completely squandered by the naval command. The Anzac forces were now sailing toward an enemy who was thoroughly prepared, deeply entrenched, and waiting for their arrival. Major General Bridges paced the deck of his command ship, his mind constantly analyzing the countless variables that could dictate the outcome of the impending assault. He understood that the initial landing phase would be characterized by immense confusion and high casualties, requiring exceptional leadership from his junior officers and non-commissioned officers like Sergeant Miller. The complex timetable relied heavily on precise naval navigation and rapid infantry deployment, assuming the covering forces could quickly secure the high ground overlooking the designated landing zones. Any significant deviation from this rigid schedule could rapidly precipitate a catastrophic military disaster on the beaches. As the final days of April approached, the weather conditions around Lemnos remained remarkably calm, offering a brief, deceptive window of tranquility before the impending storm of violence. The soldiers wrote their final letters home, carefully sealing them with a profound sense of uncertainty and unspoken dread. Many attended improvised religious services held on the open decks, seeking spiritual solace in the face of their own mortality. Sergeant Miller observed these quiet rituals, recognizing the universal human vulnerability that bound his diverse platoon together. He checked his service revolver one last time, ensuring the intricate mechanism functioned flawlessly. On the afternoon of April 24th, the massive Allied fleet finally began to weigh anchor, slowly maneuvering out of the protected harbor at Mudros. The heavily laden transport vessels formed a sprawling, majestic convoy, accompanied by the imposing, gray silhouettes of British warships, tasked with providing preliminary naval bombardment. The men lined the railings in complete silence, watching the rugged coastline of Lemnos gradually fade into the approaching twilight. A palpable sense of historical destiny settled over the entire expeditionary force as they sailed deliberately toward the hostile shores of the Gallipoli Peninsula and their inevitable baptism of fire. The journey across the dark, undulating surface of the Aegean Sea was characterized by a strict, enforced silence, an attempt to mask the fleet's approach from Ottoman coastal observers. Below decks, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of unwashed bodies, rifle oil, and the sharp tang of nervous sweat. Soldiers sat huddled together in the dimly lit compartments, their faces obscured by the shadows, lost in their own private contemplations. Sergeant Miller sat quietly among his men, feeling the rhythmic, powerful vibrations of the ship's massive engines driving them relentlessly toward the unseen, heavily fortified enemy positions. Around midnight, the transport vessels reached their designated rendezvous points, gently dropping anchor several miles off the western coast of the Gallipoli Peninsula. The intricate process of transferring thousands of heavily burdened infantrymen from the large transport ships into smaller, vulnerable towing boats began in the absolute darkness. This hazardous operation was conducted with hushed urgency, every clink of equipment or muffled cough seemingly magnified in the still, silent air. The soldiers climbed down the precarious wooden scramble nets, their heavy backpacks threatening to pull them backward into the cold, unforgiving depths of the Black Ocean below. Sergeant Miller ensured his entire section successfully navigated the treacherous descent, counting each man as they dropped heavily into the waiting wooden rowboats. The small craft were dangerously overcrowded, the soldiers sitting shoulder to shoulder, their rifles gripped tightly in their sweating hands. The naval steam pinnaces slowly took up the slack on the heavy tow ropes, pulling strings of the smaller rowboats toward the invisible shoreline. The night was exceptionally dark, the moon obscured by thick clouds, providing a crucial, natural cloak of concealment for the vulnerable invasion force as they crept toward the enemy territory. The immense scale of the tactical operation became apparent even in the darkness, as hundreds of these small boats simultaneously moved toward the designated landing zones. Major General Bridges observed the silent, spectral procession from the bridge of a supporting naval vessel, silently praying that the complex navigational calculations were perfectly accurate. The success of the entire campaign hinged entirely upon the leading battalions, rapidly establishing a secure beachhead and immediately pushing inland to dominate the commanding ridgelines before the Ottoman reserves could effectively mobilize and launch overwhelming counterattacks against the highly vulnerable troops trapped on the sand. As the small boats drew closer to the peninsula, the imposing, dark silhouette of the rugged coastal terrain slowly materialized against the marginally lighter night sky. The men strained their eyes, attempting to distinguish specific geographical features, but the landscape remained an intimidating, featureless black mass rising abruptly from the water. The silence was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic, mechanical chugging of the steam pinnaces and the soft, continuous splashing of water against the wooden bows. Sergeant Miller whispered a final, sharp command to his tense platoon. Fix bayonets and prepare to disembark the moment we touch sand. The cold sea breeze bit into their faces as they closed the final distance to the hostile, unseen shore. Every man in the boat felt the terrifying, crushing weight of anticipation, a physiological response to the imminent transition from absolute silence to chaotic violence. They were the first wave, the designated spearhead of a massive imperial army tasked with achieving the impossible against a determined, entrenched adversary. The Australian military identity, previously unformed and entirely theoretical, was about to be forged in the devastating crucible of modern combat on a foreign beach thousands of miles from their beloved homeland. Unbeknownst to the soldiers approaching in the darkness, a critical navigational error had already occurred, silently altering the trajectory of the entire military campaign. Strong, unpredictable coastal currents had gradually pushed the landing craft significantly northward of their intended, relatively flat landing zone at Gaba Tepe. Instead of approaching a manageable beach, the Anzac forces were heading directly toward an extremely narrow strip of sand, dominated by a series of steep, heavily scrub-covered cliffs and deep, treacherous ravines. This seemingly minor navigational deviation would soon result in unimaginable tactical difficulties and profoundly horrific casualties for the leading assault battalions. The final moments before the inevitable contact with the shore stretched out with agonizing, unbearable slowness. The soldiers braced themselves against the wooden gunwales, their knuckles white with tension, their breathing shallow and rapid. They were entering a terrifying, unknown void, entirely reliant on the men beside them and the unwavering discipline instilled by leaders like Sergeant Miller. The theoretical abstractions of duty, empire, and military glory were rapidly dissolving, replaced by a visceral, instinctual desire simply to survive the horrific ordeal that awaited them in the fast-approaching darkness of the rugged Gallipoli terrain. Suddenly, a single, brilliant yellow flare shot aggressively into the dark sky from the top of the imposing cliffs, illuminating the approaching flotilla with a stark, unnatural clarity. The element of surprise was instantly shattered, replaced by the terrifying realization that the enemy was awake, aware, and heavily armed. The silence of the night was brutally ripped apart by the sharp, rhythmic crack of a solitary Ottoman rifle, immediately followed by the devastating, continuous roar of heavy machine gun fire tearing mercilessly into the crowded, defenseless wooden boats. The bloody reality of the Gallipoli campaign had officially begun. Sergeant Miller instinctively ducked as a hail of lead shredded the wooden side of their small landing craft, throwing splinters into the faces of the terrified young men beside him. "Keep your heads down and get ready to move," he roared over the deafening cacophony of the incoming enemy fire and the desperate screams of the sudden wounded. The boat slammed violently into the unseen underwater obstacles and the sandy bottom, jarring the soldiers forward. There was no time for hesitation or strategic planning now. There was only the desperate, frantic scramble over the sides and into the freezing, blood-stained water. The frigid waters of the Aegean Sea shocked the young Australian soldiers as they plunged overboard, heavily burdened by soaking wet wool uniforms and cumbersome equipment packs. Sergeant Thomas Miller hit the water hard, immediately tasting the bitter salt and hearing the terrifying hiss of bullets striking the waves all around him. He struggled to find his footing on the treacherous, shifting seabed, desperately pulling himself forward through the surf. "Keep moving toward the sand! Don't stop here!" Miller bellowed, grabbing a paralyzed private by the webbing and physically hauling the terrified boy toward the chaotic, heavily contested shoreline. Dawn was just beginning to break, casting a pale, ghostly light over the nightmare unfolding on the narrow beachhead. Instead of the relatively flat terrain they had been briefed to expect, an intimidating wall of steep, scrub-covered cliffs loomed directly ahead, dominating the shoreline. The navigational error had placed the Anzac forces at a severe tactical disadvantage. Directly beneath well-concealed Ottoman defenders who were pouring devastating enfilading fire into the disorganized, vulnerable landing craft, men were falling in the shallows, the pristine water rapidly turning a horrifying crimson as the initial assault wave suffered catastrophic, immediate casualties. Miller finally dragged himself onto the shingle, gasping for breath and immediately diving behind a small, inadequate sandbank for meager cover. The noise was absolutely deafening. A relentless cacophony of exploding shrapnel shells, rattling Maxim machine guns, and the agonizing screams of the wounded and dying. The meticulously planned chain of command had disintegrated within minutes of the first shot being fired, leaving isolated groups of men desperately seeking leadership. Miller quickly assessed the terrifying situation, realizing that staying pinned down on the exposed beach meant certain death for his surviving men. "We have to climb," he yelled desperately. Officers and non-commissioned officers from different, intermingled units desperately attempted to rally the scattered, bewildered troops into ad hoc fighting formations. They pointed frantically toward the imposing, rugged ridges above, urging the men to charge upward into the dense, thorny scrub to silence the deadly Ottoman guns. Stripping off their heavy, waterlogged packs, small bands of determined Australians began to claw their way up the near-vertical precipices, driven by pure adrenaline and the desperate instinct to survive. It was a chaotic, uncoordinated assault, relying entirely on individual initiative and raw physical endurance rather than any coherent tactical strategy. Aboard the Naval Command vessel standing offshore, Major General William Bridges watched the horrific spectacle unfold with a growing sense of profound dread. Through his binoculars, he witnessed the sheer cliffs that had not appeared on their faulty intelligence maps, instantly understanding the catastrophic implications of the navigational drift. The meticulously crafted battle plan was utterly irrelevant now. The survival of his entire division depended on the sheer willpower of the infantrymen currently fighting for their lives on those bloody slopes. Bridges immediately ordered subsequent reinforcement waves to land, hoping sheer numbers could overwhelm the entrenched defenders. Back on the treacherous cliffs, Sergeant Miller led a small, desperate band of survivors upward through the confusing, suffocating undergrowth. The terrain was incredibly rugged, characterized by deep, intersecting ravines and sharp ridges that isolated individual groups and severely hampered communication. Ottoman snipers, intimately familiar with the complex topography, picked off the climbing Australians with terrifying accuracy. "Keep your heads down and watch the ridgeline," Miller cautioned, his rifle constantly raised as they navigated a narrow, heavily contested gully. Every inch of ground was paid for in blood, a brutal testament to the ferocity of the defending forces. The fighting rapidly deteriorated into vicious, localized skirmishes fought at incredibly close quarters within the dense, confusing scrub. Australian soldiers, separated from their designated officers, formed spontaneous squads under whoever demonstrated the necessary tactical initiative and aggressive courage. Bayonets were fixed as they stumbled upon concealed Ottoman defensive trenches, engaging in brutal, desperate hand-to-hand combat where hesitation meant immediate death. Miller fired his revolver point-blank at a defending soldier emerging from a hidden dugout, the chaotic violence stripping away all illusions of military glory and replacing them with a primal, desperate struggle for mere physical survival. As the morning progressed, the brilliant Mediterranean sun illuminated the full, horrifying extent of the tactical disaster unfolding at Anzac Cove. The narrow beach was heavily congested with dead and wounded men, shattered landing craft, and vital supplies that could not be safely moved inland. Medical personnel worked frantically under continuous enemy artillery bombardment, attempting to stabilize horrifically injured soldiers with severely limited resources. The agonizing cries for stretcher bearers echoed continuously across the blood-soaked sand, a haunting, desperate soundtrack to the immense human tragedy of this thoroughly botched, deeply flawed amphibious military operation. Despite the overwhelming odds and the devastating casualties, small, determined pockets of Australian infantry miraculously managed to push inland, capturing several prominent tactical ridges. They dug hasty, shallow rifle pits into the hard, unforgiving earth, using their entrenching tools and bayonets, desperately preparing for the inevitable, massive Ottoman counterattacks. Major General Bridges finally came ashore, establishing a precarious divisional headquarters on the beach itself, constantly exposed to lethal enemy shrapnel fire. He desperately sought to establish a coherent, unified defensive perimeter, attempting to link the isolated, exhausted forward units into a continuous, defensible front line before nightfall. The Ottoman command, initially surprised by the exact location of the Allied landing, rapidly mobilized their substantial tactical reserves. Under the brilliant, aggressive leadership of Colonel Mustafa Kemal, entire Ottoman regiments were rushed forward to fiercely contest the high ground and drive the invaders back into the sea. The fighting on the crucial ridges reached a fever pitch of intensity, with desperate, bloody bayonet charges and countercharges rolling back and forth across the disputed, heavily scarred landscape. Sergeant Miller and his exhausted men fired their rifles until the barrels literally blistered their hands, desperately holding their precarious position. Ammunition supplies among the forward Australian units became critically low, forcing men to scavenge cartridges from the bodies of their fallen comrades. Communication with the beach headquarters was practically non-existent, relying entirely on incredibly brave runners who sprinted through heavily targeted gullies, facing almost certain death. "Hold the line, lads, they cannot break us here," Miller roared, attempting to inspire his terrified, exhausted platoon as another massive wave of Ottoman infantry surged toward their shallow, inadequate trench. The sheer, overwhelming volume of enemy fire threatened to completely obliterate their fragile, highly vulnerable defensive position at any moment. As the bloody afternoon wore on, the situation for the Anzac forces became increasingly desperate and tactically untenable. Several advanced positions were entirely overrun, the surviving defenders forced to conduct chaotic, fighting withdrawals down the steep, treacherous ravines. The constant, terrifying roar of artillery and the continuous clatter of machine guns shattered the nerves of even the most hardened veterans. Many junior officers had been killed or severely wounded, leaving the heavy burden of tactical leadership squarely upon the shoulders of battle-weary non-commissioned officers like Sergeant Miller, who refused to yield an inch of ground without a fierce fight. Down on the crowded, chaotic beachhead, Major General Bridges faced a monumental, agonizing command dilemma as night rapidly approached. Some senior officers, profoundly shaken by the staggering casualty rates and the precarious tactical situation, strongly advised an immediate, full-scale evacuation of the entire expeditionary force under the cover of darkness. Bridges consulted urgently with the naval commanders, realizing that extracting thousands of disorganized, wounded men from the contested beach would likely result in an absolute massacre. He firmly decided that the Anzacs must stand their ground and dig in, regardless of the terrible cost in human lives. The famous command from British General Ian Hamilton finally arrived via naval signal: "Dig, dig, dig until you are safe." This stark, uncompromising order solidified the immediate fate of the exhausted Australian soldiers clinging desperately to the rugged hillsides. The men utilized every available implement, including their bare, bleeding hands, to deepen their shallow, inadequate trenches into more permanent, defensible fortifications. Sergeant Miller supervised his surviving squad members as they worked frantically in the gathering darkness, knowing that their very survival depended entirely upon the depth and strength of the dirt walls surrounding them before the morning light returned. The first night on the Gallipoli Peninsula was a terrifying, sleepless ordeal for the exhausted, traumatized soldiers of the Anzac Corps. Constant, aggressive Ottoman probing attacks kept the entire defensive line on high alert, firing blindly into the thick, confusing darkness at any perceived movement or suspicious noise. The cold night air was repeatedly pierced by the agonizing, unanswered cries of wounded men stranded in the deadly area between the opposing trenches, a place that would soon become infamously known as No Man's Land. The psychological toll of the brutal, chaotic landing began to manifest heavily. By dawn of the second day, a recognizable, continuous front line had miraculously coalesced along the rugged, commanding ridges. It was a highly precarious, deeply flawed defensive position, entirely lacking in strategic depth and heavily dominated by higher, well-fortified Ottoman observation posts. However, against all reasonable tactical odds and suffering horrific casualties, the Australians had successfully secured a small, vital foothold on the hostile peninsula. The initial, disastrous landing phase had formally concluded, violently transitioning into a brutal, static siege that would test the physical and mental endurance of these men beyond all imaginable human limits. Sergeant Miller slumped exhausted against the dirt wall of his newly dug trench, his uniform stiff with dried blood and thick coastal mud. He looked around at the hollow, traumatized faces of his surviving men, realizing that their youthful innocence had been entirely obliterated in just 24 hours of unrelenting, mechanized violence. They were no longer the naive, enthusiastic volunteers who had eagerly trained in the scorching Egyptian desert. They had been violently baptized in the horrific crucible of modern warfare, permanently transformed into hardened, cynical veterans by the sheer, unadulterated terror of the bloody Anzac Cove landing. The devastating human cost of securing this tiny, highly vulnerable strip of foreign territory was absolutely staggering and deeply sobering. Thousands of young Australian and New Zealand soldiers had been killed or severely wounded in the chaotic assault, their broken bodies littering the steep ravines and the blood-stained shoreline. The ambitious, grand strategic vision of quickly capturing Constantinople had been thoroughly shattered by the harsh, uncompromising reality of the determined Ottoman resistance. Major General Bridges surveyed the cramped, battered beachhead, knowing that their desperate struggle for mere survival on this unforgiving peninsula had only just begun. The legend of the Anzac soldier was being forged not in glorious, sweeping tactical victories, but in the grim, resolute endurance of unimaginable hardship and catastrophic failure. The men had fought with an unparalleled, desperate ferocity, demonstrating a profound, instinctive loyalty to their comrades that would become the absolute cornerstone of the emerging Australian military identity. Sergeant Miller meticulously cleaned his jammed rifle, preparing for the inevitable resumption of hostilities as the morning sun rose higher. "We hold this bloody ditch," he muttered grimly to himself, accepting the brutal, inescapable reality of their highly precarious tactical situation. The initial shock of the chaotic, disorganized landing gradually gave way to a grim, determined acceptance of their terrifying new reality. The soldiers quickly learned the vital importance of maintaining discipline under continuous, heavy fire, relying entirely on the steadfast courage of the men occupying the trench directly beside them. Every mundane task, from fetching heavily rationed water to attempting to evacuate the numerous wounded, was fraught with extreme danger from highly accurate, completely concealed enemy snipers. The beachhead itself remained a prime target for continuous Ottoman artillery bombardment, offering absolutely no safe haven for the exhausted troops. Despite the terrifying barrage, vital supplies and subsequent troop reinforcements continued to be slowly, methodically offloaded onto the congested, heavily targeted beach. Medical clearing stations operated continuously under incredibly primitive, desperate conditions, desperately trying to save the lives of heavily mangled, bleeding men. The sheer logistical nightmare of sustaining an entire trapped army on this tiny, barren strip of land was a monumental, nearly impossible task that constantly threatened the overall viability of the entire campaign. Bridges tirelessly organized the defense, his calm, authoritative demeanor providing a vital anchor of stability amidst the swirling, chaotic violence. The Ottoman forces, realizing they had failed to immediately push the invaders back into the sea, began establishing their own extensive, intricate trench networks directly opposite the Australian lines. This rapid, mutual fortification permanently locked both armies into a deadly, intimate embrace, effectively completely eliminating any possibility of a swift, decisive maneuver battle. The Gallipoli campaign had rapidly degenerated into a grueling, static war of attrition, where massive casualties were routinely traded for mere yards of barren, strategically insignificant dirt. Miller watched the enemy digging just a stone's throw away, understanding the brutal, endless stalemate that awaited them. The heroism displayed during those chaotic first 48 hours firmly established a legendary reputation that would define the Australian military for generations to come. The stubborn, unyielding refusal to surrender the captured ridges, despite suffering overwhelming catastrophic losses, demonstrated a unique, highly resilient national character forged in extreme adversity. These men had landed as inexperienced, enthusiastic colonial volunteers, but they had violently earned the profound, hard-won respect of their enemies and their imperial commanders alike. The bloody baptism at Anzac Cove was a spectacular tactical failure, yet it birthed an enduring, powerful myth of mateship and sacrifice. As the sun finally set on the second day, casting long, dark shadows across the pulverized, unrecognizable landscape, a tense, uneasy quiet settled over the frontline trenches. Sergeant Miller distributed the meager, remaining rations to his exhausted, hollow-eyed platoon, offering quiet words of grim encouragement to the surviving teenagers under his command. They had survived the initial, horrifying slaughter of the beachhead landing, securing a fragile, precarious toehold on the edge of the contested peninsula. However, as they stared into the intimidating, hostile darkness, they understood that the true, agonizing ordeal of the Gallipoli campaign was merely beginning. By late May, the frantic, bloody chaos of the initial landing had solidified into a grinding, static nightmare of trench warfare. The opposing lines on the Gallipoli Peninsula were terrifyingly close, sometimes separated by mere yards of pulverized earth. The scorching Mediterranean summer arrived with a vengeance, turning the steep, contested ravines into suffocating, sun-baked ovens. Sergeant Thomas Miller wiped a thick layer of grime from his face, realizing that the immediate threat of enemy bullets was now matched by the insidious, pervasive dangers of the harsh environment itself. The smell of the battlefield became an oppressive, physical presence that assaulted the senses relentlessly day and night. Thousands of unburied corpses lay decomposing in the narrow strip of no man's land, baking under the relentless, unforgiving sun. It was a sweet, sickening stench that clung to the soldiers' ragged uniforms and infiltrated their meager rations. Truces were occasionally and desperately arranged simply to bury the mounting dead, offering brief, surreal moments of humanity where enemies labored side by side in the devastated dirt before returning to the slaughter. Accompanying the unbearable heat and the horrific stench was a biblical plague of relentless, tormenting flies. They swarmed in massive, black clouds, instantly covering any exposed skin, open wound, or piece of food. The insects were a maddening, inescapable torment, but they also acted as highly effective vectors for crippling, debilitating diseases. Dysentery and typhoid rapidly swept through the cramped, unsanitary trenches, decimating the Australian ranks far more effectively than Ottoman artillery fire. Men became living skeletons, their physical strength utterly sapped by the constant, agonizing intestinal illnesses. Sergeant Miller watched his once robust platoon wither away, their youthful vigor replaced by hollow eyes and trembling hands. He ruthlessly enforced strict hygiene protocols, demanding that latrines be thoroughly covered and drinking water meticulously boiled despite the crippling scarcity of fuel. "You fight the sickness just as hard as you fight the Turk," he told a severely weakened private, forcing him to drink a foul-tasting, chlorinated ration. Miller understood that maintaining baseline physical health was absolutely essential to preserving their fighting capability in this miserable, disease-ridden purgatory. Beyond the ravages of disease, the constant psychological terror of the unseen Ottoman snipers dictated every movement within the Anzac perimeter. The enemy marksmen were intimately familiar with the complex terrain, utilizing expertly camouflaged positions to dominate the vital supply routes and communication trenches. A carelessly raised head or a lingering silhouette against the skyline invited an immediate, fatal rifle shot. The men learned to move with a perpetual stooped posture, navigating the labyrinthine trench network with an instinctual, ingrained paranoia that steadily eroded their underlying mental resilience. The primary logistical artery of the entire Australian position was a steep, highly exposed ravine known ominously as Shrapnel Gully. Everything required to sustain the beleaguered army, ammunition, food, water, and reinforcements, had to traverse this deadly, heavily targeted corridor. Ottoman artillery batteries continually pounded the valley floor, blanketing the area with lethal, raining iron. Navigating the gully was a terrifying gamble with death, requiring men to sprint desperately between meager cover while the ground around them erupted in violent, deafening geysers of shattered rock and tearing shrapnel. Amidst this continuous, terrifying barrage, an extraordinary figure emerged, entirely unarmed and seemingly immune to the surrounding carnage. Private John Simpson Kirkpatrick, a British-born stretcher-bearer serving with the Australian Medical Corps, recognized the impossibility of manually carrying the severely wounded down the treacherous, mile-long slope. Displaying remarkable initiative, he commandeered a small, sturdy local donkey, utilizing the animal to transport immobile casualties from the frontline trenches directly to the beach hospitals. He began operating independently, driven by a profound, singular dedication to saving his critically injured comrades. Simpson and his donkey, famously named Murphy, became a ubiquitous, deeply reassuring sight in the deadly confines of Shrapnel Gully. Day after day, ignoring the explicit orders of his superiors and the continuous, terrifying roar of incoming artillery, he calmly led the animal up the perilous, shell-pocked tracks. He worked tirelessly from dawn until dusk, gently loading heavily bleeding men onto the donkey's back and guiding them slowly down to safety. His unwavering, cheerful demeanor provided an invaluable psychological boost to the deeply demoralized, exhausted infantrymen. The sheer, unadulterated bravery required to repeatedly traverse the most dangerous terrain on the entire peninsula was staggering. Simpson never hurried, never flinched at the deafening explosions, and maintained a steady, reassuring conversation with his agonized passengers. He was a beacon of pure, selfless humanity amidst the absolute, mechanized barbarity of the ongoing siege. The Australian soldiers occupying the surrounding ridges watched his slow, deliberate progress with a mixture of profound awe and intense, protective anxiety, viewing the humble stretcher-bearer as a living, breathing symbol of their collective resilience. Sergeant Miller frequently observed Simpson passing his sector, marveling at the man's quiet, unassuming courage under continuous fire. "That man has more grit than an entire bloody battalion," Miller remarked to his corporal, watching the donkey carefully navigate a newly formed artillery crater. The dedication of the unarmed medical personnel struck a deep chord within the hardened infantrymen. They realized that while they were tasked with the grim business of dealing death, men like Simpson represented the enduring, vital preservation of life in a landscape entirely consumed by destruction. As the harsh summer dragged on, the intense, unrelenting pressure of the static stalemate began to fracture the soldiers' minds. The constant noise, the sleep deprivation, and the horrific, unavoidable proximity to death created a profound psychological trauma that was entirely unacknowledged by the military authorities. Men stared blankly at the dirt walls, suffering from severe shell shock, their nervous systems completely shattered by the continuous bombardments. Miller spent hours talking quietly with his men, trying to anchor them to reality and prevent them from succumbing to utter despair. In the depths of this immense suffering, a profound, unbreakable bond of brotherhood was forged among the surviving Australian soldiers. This concept of mateship transcended traditional military discipline, rooted instead in a deep, mutual reliance and a shared, profound endurance of unimaginable hardship. They shared their last drops of water, selflessly volunteered for highly dangerous patrols to protect their exhausted peers, and risked certain death to recover the bodies of their fallen friends. It was a fiercely egalitarian loyalty that would permanently define the national military identity. High above the squalor of the frontline trenches, the Strategic Command continued to grapple with the overarching, disastrous failure of the campaign. Major General William Bridges, commanding the Australian Division, frequently visited the forward positions, insisting on directly assessing the true, horrific conditions his men were facing. Unlike many senior commanders who remained safely insulated on the naval vessels, Bridges exposed himself to the same lethal dangers as his lowest-ranking privates. He understood the desperate, precarious nature of their situation and constantly advocated for improved logistical support. Bridges recognized that the current attrition rate was completely unsustainable, slowly bleeding his division white without achieving any significant tactical gains. The heavily fortified Ottoman lines were virtually impregnable to frontal assaults, and the limited Allied artillery was entirely insufficient to break the deeply entrenched stalemate. He sent urgent, highly critical reports back to the overall command, demanding substantial reinforcements and an entirely new strategic approach. However, his realistic, brutally honest assessments were largely ignored by the distant architects of the campaign, who remained stubbornly committed to the failing endeavor. The profound dangers of the front line did not discriminate between privates and generals in the claustrophobic confines of Gallipoli. In mid-May, while conducting a routine, dangerous inspection of the forward trenches in Monash Valley, Major General Bridges was specifically targeted and mortally wounded by an expert Ottoman sniper. The bullet struck him cleanly in the femoral artery, causing massive, unstoppable bleeding. Despite immediate frantic medical attention, the esteemed commander succumbed to his severe injuries several days later aboard a hospital ship, leaving the division entirely without its respected leader. The sudden, shocking death of General Bridges sent a profound ripple of sorrow and apprehension throughout the entire Australian contingent. He had been a stern, demanding officer, but one who was deeply respected for his undeniable physical courage and his genuine concern for the welfare of his troops. Sergeant Miller absorbed the grim news with a heavy heart, realizing that their situation was becoming increasingly dire. The loss of their primary advocate in the high command meant that the suffering of the infantrymen would likely be prolonged and intensified. The cruel, indiscriminate nature of the battlefield also claimed the lives of those who selflessly dedicated themselves to saving others. On May 19th, during a massive, ferocious Ottoman counterattack, Private John Simpson Kirkpatrick was navigating Shrapnel Gully with a wounded man on his donkey. A sudden, devastating burst of enemy machine gun fire swept across the exposed track, striking Simpson directly in the chest and killing him instantly. The humble stretcher-bearer, who had miraculously survived countless perilous journeys, finally fell in the treacherous valley he had tirelessly worked to conquer. Simpson's tragic death deeply affected the men who had relied on his unwavering courage and cheerful resilience. He had transported hundreds of critically wounded soldiers to safety in just 3.5 weeks, demonstrating a profound, individual heroism that completely transcended the organized, mechanized slaughter. The image of the man and his donkey became deeply ingrained in the collective memory of the Anzac forces, forever symbolizing the absolute core values of selfless sacrifice, mateship, and incredible bravery under fire that defined the Australian spirit. The grinding war of attrition continued relentlessly throughout the brutal, unforgiving summer months, completely indifferent to the individual tragedies unfolding daily. The lines remained virtually static, a bloody stalemate where massive, horrific casualties were sustained for absolutely no strategic advantage. Sergeant Miller marked the passing days by the growing number of crude, wooden crosses populating the small, improvised cemeteries overlooking the beautiful, azure Aegean Sea. He wrote difficult, emotionally guarded letters to the families of his fallen men, struggling to find meaning in the overwhelming, senseless slaughter surrounding him. The physical and mental exhaustion of the Australian troops reached a critical, entirely unsustainable breaking point as August approached. The initial, optimistic belief in a swift, glorious victory had been completely replaced by a grim, cynical endurance of constant misery. They were trapped in a highly toxic, disease-ridden environment, surrounded by the decaying dead, and constantly subjected to lethal enemy fire. The promised reinforcements arrived sporadically, only to be immediately fed into the insatiable, horrific meat grinder of the frontline trenches, perfectly maintaining the horrific status quo. High Command, completely unwilling to admit absolute strategic defeat, began quietly plotting a massive, desperate summer offensive to finally break the deadlock. Rumors of an impending, large-scale assault slowly filtered down to the exhausted men in the forward lines, generating a tense, highly conflicted atmosphere. They desperately desired an end to the miserable, static trench warfare, but they also acutely understood the terrifying, catastrophic casualty rates associated with charging heavily fortified Ottoman machine gun positions. Miller carefully inspected his men's weaponry, preparing for the inevitable bloody climax of the campaign. As July mercifully drew to a close, the stifling heat remained, but the terrifying anticipation of the upcoming battle provided a new, sharper edge to their daily suffering. The men tightened their webbing and checked their bayonet fittings, knowing they would soon be ordered to leave the relative safety of the earth and charge into the open. The true, ultimate test of their deeply forged mateship and their newfound, hardened military identity was rapidly approaching. The horrific stalemate was ending, but the impending violence promised to be unimaginably severe. The Anzac legend, born on the bloody beaches, had been deeply tempered and solidified in the diseased, fly-blown trenches of the summer stalemate. These young Australians had learned to rely entirely on each other, displaying a remarkable, uniquely egalitarian spirit that fundamentally separated them from their more rigid imperial counterparts. Sergeant Miller looked out across the desolate, heavily scarred landscape, his face deeply lined with a profound, unspoken sorrow. He knew that the impending offensive would require a level of sacrifice that would permanently scar the soul of their young nation. The commanders finalized their ambitious, highly complex operational plans, hoping to finally seize the dominating heights and secure a decisive victory. However, the soldiers on the ground held no such grand, strategic illusions. They simply prepared to fight and die for the men standing beside them in the dirt. The immense, tragic weight of the Gallipoli campaign pressed down heavily upon the entire peninsula, a suffocating blanket of impending doom. The brutal, unforgiving crucible of modern warfare had thoroughly prepared them for the catastrophic slaughter that awaited in the approaching August offensive. By early August, the British High Command finalized a highly ambitious and incredibly risky operational strategy intended to finally break the crippling Gallipoli stalemate. The overarching objective of this massive summer offensive was to simultaneously launch multiple coordinated assaults, deliberately overwhelming the entrenched Ottoman defenders and successfully capturing the dominating Sari Bair Ridge system. If the Allied forces could secure these elevated topographical positions, they could effectively control the entire peninsula and finally force a decisive, victorious conclusion to the protracted, deeply costly military campaign that had stalled for months. The Anzac forces were assigned a critical, devastatingly bloody role within this grand strategic maneuver. To divert crucial Ottoman reinforcements away from the primary northern assault sectors, the 1st Australian Brigade was ordered to execute a massive, frontal diversionary attack against a heavily fortified enemy position known as Lone Pine. The tactical intelligence regarding the absolute strength of these defensive trenches was tragically flawed, severely underestimating the extensive overhead log cover and the sheer volume of concentrated machine gun fire that awaited the advancing Australian infantrymen in the impending late-afternoon assault. Sergeant Thomas Miller gathered his exhausted, severely depleted platoon in the claustrophobic staging trenches on the afternoon of August 6th, fully understanding the suicidal nature of their imminent frontal charge. He meticulously inspected every rifle and bayonet, his face a grim mask of hardened professional resolve, masking his profound internal sorrow. "We hit their line hard, we drop into their trenches, and we do not stop fighting until the position is completely secured or we are all dead," Miller instructed his nervous men in a low, unwavering, and intensely serious voice. A deafening concentrated artillery bombardment commenced late in the afternoon, aggressively pounding the Ottoman positions at Lone Pine with high explosive shells in a desperate attempt to shatter the formidable timber defenses. However, the heavy wooden logs covering the enemy trenches largely withstood the intense explosive barrage, leaving the subterranean defensive network largely intact and highly operational. At exactly 5:30 in the evening, the artillery abruptly ceased, creating a terrifying, momentary vacuum of silence before the shrill, piercing blast of officers' whistles universally signaled the immediate commencement of the catastrophic infantry assault. The Australian soldiers erupted from their subterranean staging areas, instantly scrambling over the defensive parapets and aggressively surging forward into the pulverized, completely exposed expanse of no man's land. A devastating, concentrated hail of Ottoman machine gun and rifle fire immediately tore through their advancing ranks, indiscriminately cutting down dozens of running men within the first few agonizing seconds of the chaotic charge. Sergeant Miller sprinted desperately through the swirling dust and deafening explosions, violently urging his surviving men forward toward the imposing, heavily timbered enemy breastworks that loomed menacingly ahead. Upon miraculously reaching the Ottoman front line, the surviving Australian attackers were confronted by a horrifying, completely unanticipated tactical obstacle. The enemy trenches were entirely enclosed by massive, tightly packed pine logs, deliberately designed to thoroughly protect the defenders from shrapnel and completely preventing the attacking infantry from simply dropping into the defensive works. The Australians desperately clawed at the heavy timber roofing, frantically attempting to forcefully pry the thick logs apart with their bare hands and bayonets, while being continuously shot from adjacent, perfectly positioned enemy enfilade firing points. A small, frantic group of soldiers near Sergeant Miller finally managed to violently dislodge a section of the heavy timber roof, creating a narrow, highly perilous opening directly into the dark, chaotic subterranean trench below. Without a single moment of hesitation, Miller immediately plunged feet first through the newly created breach, gripping his heavy service revolver tightly as he aggressively plummeted into the claustrophobic, smoke-filled darkness of the heavily occupied Ottoman defensive position. Several of his brave, deeply loyal men instantly followed his terrifying descent, plunging directly into a nightmare of horrific close-quarters combat. The fighting within the enclosed, suffocating confines of the Lone Pine trenches was an unimaginably brutal, visceral struggle for mere physical survival. The narrow, twisting corridors were completely plunged into absolute darkness, forcing the desperate combatants to ruthlessly engage in blind, chaotic hand-to-hand combat using bayonets, heavy trench clubs, and their bare, bloodied hands. The deafening, concussive roar of discharged rifles in the enclosed space shattered men's eardrums, while the thick, acrid smoke from continuously firing weapons severely restricted breathing and rapidly turned the underground network into a terrifying, lethal maze. Sergeant Miller fiercely battled his way through the congested, corpse-choked communication trenches, relying entirely on raw, instinctual aggression to survive the relentless, overwhelming enemy counterattacks. He accurately fired his heavy revolver until the metallic cylinder was completely empty, before violently resorting to desperately parrying incoming bayonet thrusts with his own shattered, blood-soaked rifle stock. The horrific, intimate nature of the subterranean slaughter profoundly scarred the surviving soldiers, stripping away every single remaining illusion of glorious civilized warfare and reducing the desperate conflict to its most primitive, deeply savage, and unadulterated essence. After 3 days of continuous, unimaginable subterranean carnage, the incredibly exhausted Australian forces finally secured definitive, total control over the devastated Lone Pine Trench system. The highly concentrated, localized battle had resulted in absolutely staggering, completely disproportionate casualties for both the attacking Anzacs and the desperately defending Ottoman units. The horrific, pulverized trench floors were literally paved with the interlocking, decaying bodies of thousands of fallen soldiers, creating a sickening, thoroughly macabre monument to the sheer, unparalleled ferocity and devastating human cost of this brutal, intensely localized infantry engagement. While the tragic, bloody diversion at Lone Pine ultimately succeeded in aggressively drawing crucial Ottoman reserves away from the primary northern sectors, the primary, grand strategic offensive was simultaneously encountering profound, catastrophic failures elsewhere. The most thoroughly devastating and tragically futile engagement of the entire August offensive unfolded just before dawn on the morning of August 7th at a narrow, heavily fortified ridgeline known infamously as the Neck. This disastrous tactical maneuver would forever symbolize the profound, deeply tragic futility and catastrophic command incompetence characterizing the broader Gallipoli campaign. The 3rd Australian Light Horse Brigade, operating entirely without their mounts as standard ground infantry, was officially ordered to execute a massive frontal bayonet charge against heavily entrenched Ottoman machine gun positions situated across an incredibly narrow, highly exposed strip of open terrain. A crucial, devastating failure in basic battlefield synchronization meant that the preceding naval artillery bombardment was inexplicably halted a full 7 minutes before the designated infantry assault was scheduled to aggressively commence. This fatal, deeply catastrophic timing error completely allowed the stunned Ottoman defenders to casually reoccupy their lethal firing positions. At exactly 4:30 in the morning, the tragic, piercing whistle officially signaled the immediate commencement of the doomed assault, prompting the first wave of 150 courageous Australian light horsemen to immediately vault over their defensive parapets. They aggressively surged forward into the extremely narrow, totally exposed killing zone, their fixed bayonets gleaming faintly in the pale, nascent pre-dawn light. Within mere seconds, a perfectly synchronized, utterly devastating wall of concentrated Ottoman machine gun fire entirely annihilated the advancing rank, indiscriminately cutting down every single charging soldier before they could advance 10 yards. Despite vividly witnessing the absolute, horrific slaughter of their closest comrades, the deeply disciplined men of the second wave dutifully prepared to aggressively follow their precise, uncompromising tactical orders. Exactly 2 minutes after the first disastrous charge, they resolutely scrambled out of their blood-soaked trenches and immediately hurled themselves directly into the unyielding, mechanized hailstorm of enemy lead. This subsequent, entirely futile assault met the exact same tragic, catastrophic fate as the first, with the entire attacking formation being brutally, methodically mowed down in a terrifyingly brief, intensely violent span of mere moments. The agonizing, completely undeniable reality of the absolute tactical massacre unfolding directly in front of them should have immediately halted any further, deeply senseless loss of Australian life. However, strict, uncompromising military rigidity and a tragic, profound breakdown in frontline communication explicitly compelled the commanding officers to aggressively order a third, completely suicidal wave into the devastated, corpse-strewn killing zone. These brave, deeply loyal soldiers firmly grasped their rifles, silently exchanged solemn, tragic farewells with their terrified mates, and resolutely leaped forward into certain, absolute, and thoroughly unavoidable death. The fourth and final wave of the disastrous assault at the Neck was eventually, mercifully halted by a desperate, highly traumatized frontline officer who bravely countermanded the increasingly insane orders issuing from the deeply disconnected rear command structure. However, the profound, catastrophic damage had already been completely and irreversibly inflicted upon the shattered Australian regiments. In less than 45 horrific minutes, hundreds of Australia's finest, bravest young men had been utterly, systematically massacred in a remarkably futile, strategically pointless display of completely mismanaged, poorly coordinated imperial aggression against an impregnable enemy fortress. News of the horrific, unmitigated slaughter at the neck slowly filtered down to Sergeant Miller and his deeply traumatized, battle-weary survivors who were still desperately holding the thoroughly pulverized, corpse-filled trenches at Lone Pine. A profound, crushing wave of intense, silent despair rapidly washed over the severely depleted Australian ranks as they completely absorbed the massive, completely senseless magnitude of the tragic loss. The absolute, unshakable faith in their distant, imperial high command was fundamentally, permanently shattered, completely replaced by a deep, uniquely Australian cynicism regarding established military authority. The broader, highly ambitious August offensive comprehensively, spectacularly failed to achieve any of its primary, grand strategic objectives, thoroughly condemning the exhausted Allied forces to painfully resume the miserable, static trench warfare. The magnificent, highly coordinated Ottoman defensive network remained completely unbroken, firmly holding the crucial, dominating high ground and effectively denying the invaders any meaningful, strategic operational progress. The monumental, catastrophic human cost of these deeply flawed, desperately executed summer assaults permanently crushed any lingering, optimistic hopes of successfully capturing the Gallipoli Peninsula and achieving a decisive battlefield victory. As August slowly transitioned into the slightly cooler but equally miserable month of September, the physical and psychological condition of the surviving Anzac soldiers deeply, irreversibly deteriorated. The sheer, unadulterated magnitude of the recent catastrophic slaughter had completely sapped their collective national morale, transforming the once proud expeditionary force into a ragged, deeply emaciated collection of highly traumatized, severely exhausted survivors. Sergeant Miller quietly watched his few remaining, thoroughly hollow-eyed men mechanically cleaning their jammed, mud-caked weapons, fully realizing that their incredible, legendary endurance was rapidly approaching its absolute final human limit. The immense, deeply tragic failure of the massive August offensive officially marked a profound, highly significant turning point in the complex, evolving narrative of the entire Gallipoli military campaign. The fundamental, driving purpose of the expedition had completely shifted from confidently securing a glorious, sweeping imperial victory to merely surviving the horrific, deadly, and thoroughly miserable daily attrition. The profound, deeply ingrained concept of Australian mateship was absolutely, undeniably solidified in the bloody, pulverized dirt of Lone Pine and the Neck, forged permanently in the fires of catastrophic command failure. Military tacticians and senior political leaders in distant London finally, reluctantly began to critically acknowledge the stark, unarguable reality of the thoroughly stalemated, deeply disastrous situation on the Turkish peninsula. The continuous, extremely heavy stream of horrific casualty reports and completely demoralizing battlefield dispatches effectively forced a profound, highly contested reevaluation of the entire failing Mediterranean strategic commitment. Meanwhile, the exhausted, heavily bleeding infantrymen trapped in the miserable frontline trenches simply braced themselves for the approaching, terrifying hardships of a brutal, extremely cold winter, completely lacking adequate logistical support. Sergeant Miller firmly maintained absolute, unyielding discipline within his severely decimated, highly traumatized unit, explicitly understanding that strict, continuous routine was the only effective mechanism preventing total psychological collapse. He continuously organized dangerous, nighttime trench raids and meticulously supervised the endless, physically exhausting repair of the constantly collapsing defensive earthworks, keeping his profoundly exhausted men thoroughly occupied. "We honor our fallen brothers simply by holding this miserable, bloody ground and absolutely refusing to yield," he told them quietly, emphasizing the profound, enduring power of their deep, shared national sacrifice. The devastating, thoroughly catastrophic events of August 1915 fundamentally, permanently transformed the emerging Australian national military identity on the brutal, heavily contested global stage. The incredibly brave, deeply loyal men who valiantly charged into the terrifying, mechanized meat grinders of Lone Pine and the Neck demonstrated a uniquely powerful, profoundly resolute spirit that thoroughly transcended the immense, tragic futility of their given tactical orders. Their tremendous, heartbreaking sacrifice firmly, eternally cemented the legendary, deeply revered Anzac ethos of immense courage, profound endurance, and unshakable, fiercely egalitarian camaraderie. The brutal, scorching heat of the Mediterranean summer slowly dissipated, seamlessly replaced by the harsh, unforgiving arrival of an incredibly severe winter season. The exhausted, heavily traumatized Australian soldiers, shivering in their shallow, pulverized trenches, completely lacked adequate thermal clothing or proper waterproof equipment. Relentless, freezing rain rapidly transformed the entire, heavily contested defensive network into a terrifying, deep quagmire of freezing, knee-deep mud and decaying human remains. Sergeant Thomas Miller watched his profoundly emaciated, deeply suffering men desperately huddle together for meager warmth, their physical endurance stretched to its absolute breaking point. Late November brought a devastating, unprecedented blizzard that aggressively swept across the exposed, highly vulnerable Gallipoli Peninsula, inflicting horrific, completely unanticipated casualties upon the severely weakened garrison. Hundreds of heavily exhausted, malnourished soldiers tragically froze to death at their frontline posts, their deeply traumatized bodies completely surrendering to the overwhelming, merciless elements. Thousands more suffered from severe, crippling frostbite, requiring immediate, frantic medical evacuation from the freezing, completely submerged trench systems. The sheer, unadulterated misery of the extreme weather definitively proved to the distant Imperial High Command that holding the peninsula through winter was tactically impossible. Field Marshal Lord Kitchener, the highly esteemed British Secretary of State for War, finally conducted a personal, heavily guarded inspection of the deeply devastated Anzac Cove beachhead. Surveying the completely stalemated, highly precarious defensive positions and observing the profoundly exhausted, disease-ridden colonial troops, Kitchener immediately recognized the undeniable, stark reality of the catastrophic strategic failure. He solemnly, reluctantly advised the British War Cabinet to immediately authorize a comprehensive, full-scale military evacuation of the entire expeditionary force. This monumental, highly controversial decision officially marked the definitive, bitter end of the incredibly bloody, completely futile Gallipoli military campaign. The operational prospect of successfully withdrawing tens of thousands of deeply entrenched, highly vulnerable infantrymen from directly under the watchful, heavily armed Ottoman positions presented an unprecedented logistical nightmare. Military tacticians universally predicted catastrophic, staggering casualties during any attempted retreat, assuming the highly aggressive enemy defenders would immediately slaughter the fleeing soldiers on the exposed beaches. A brilliant, exceptionally meticulous operational plan was desperately required to completely deceive the vigilant enemy and mask the massive, highly complex logistical withdrawal. The overarching, fundamental objective was absolute, total secrecy, demanding unprecedented discipline from every single participating soldier. To effectively maintain the crucial, elaborate illusion of fully occupied, heavily defended frontline trenches, the commanding officers instituted a remarkably clever, highly systematic campaign of calculated military deception. The Anzac forces began implementing periods of absolute, highly unnatural silence, deliberately conditioning the suspicious Ottoman defenders to completely ignore lengthy intervals of total frontline inactivity. Men were strictly ordered to muffle their heavy boots with torn sandbags, completely eliminating the distinctive, rhythmic sounds of troop movements throughout the intricate, subterranean communication corridors. The entire, highly precarious operation relied entirely upon flawless, deeply disciplined execution by the exhausted infantry. Sergeant Miller received the highly classified, incredibly detailed evacuation orders with a profound, deeply complex mixture of immense physical relief and intense, lingering sorrow. He was explicitly tasked with meticulously organizing his severely depleted, heavily traumatized platoon for a completely silent, deeply synchronized nighttime withdrawal down to the crowded beachhead. We leave this bloody, awful place exactly as we arrived, with absolute, unwavering discipline and looking after our own mates. Miller instructed his deeply attentive, exhausted men in a harsh whisper. Every single piece of non-essential equipment was quietly, systematically destroyed or deliberately buried in the mud. The most famous, highly ingenious, deceptive innovation of the entire, remarkably successful withdrawal was the brilliant creation of the automated, self-firing mechanism known universally as the drip rifle Australian soldiers cleverly rigged two small, perforated ration tins, allowing water to slowly, steadily drip from the upper container directly into the lower receptacle attached to the rifle trigger. Once the lower tin became sufficiently heavy, it effectively engaged the firing mechanism, discharging the weapon and brilliantly mimicking the highly irregular, completely spontaneous sniper fire characteristic of fully manned, deeply alert defensive positions. This remarkably simple, brilliantly improvised battlefield technology allowed a highly condensed, severely restricted rear guard to effectively project the convincing lethal illusion of an entire, heavily fortified brigade. Sergeant Miller meticulously supervised the careful, precise installation of several automated drip rifles throughout his designated, deeply scarred sector of the frontline trench network. He critically adjusted the water flow rate, ensuring the staggered, highly convincing discharge of the abandoned weapons would effectively continue long after his men had silently vanished into the dark. The brilliant, completely decentralized ingenuity of the frontline soldiers ultimately saved countless vulnerable lives. The massive, highly complex logistical withdrawal was executed over several tense, incredibly dangerous weeks in heavily overcast, freezing December nights, completely prioritizing the immediate extraction of the sick and severely wounded. Successive, carefully calculated waves of exhausted infantrymen silently slipped away from the deeply contested ridges, quietly making their way down the treacherous, heavily shadowed ravines toward the waiting naval transport vessels. The defensive perimeter was systematically, ruthlessly contracted, deliberately concentrating the immense, highly perilous burden of deception onto a continuously shrinking, fiercely dedicated contingent of deeply exhausted, highly experienced veteran soldiers acting as the ultimate rearguard. By the final, incredibly tense week of the meticulously planned evacuation, the vast, sprawling Anzac Cove beachhead was practically deserted, resembling a completely abandoned, deeply haunted ghost town. Sergeant Miller and his small, fiercely loyal band of surviving veterans were specifically selected to remain in the forward, highly exposed trenches until the absolute, very last moment of the massive operation. They desperately darted between the empty, highly vulnerable firing bays, occasionally discharging their rifles and continuously throwing small, highly explosive bombs to maintain the crucial, deeply fragile illusion of a heavily occupied, thoroughly aggressive defensive line. The profound, completely overwhelming psychological pressure of occupying the deserted, terrifyingly quiet trenches was absolutely immense, significantly testing the deeply shattered nerves of the heavily traumatized rearguard. Every slight rustle of the wind through the frozen, thoroughly pulverized scrub or distant, isolated crack of an enemy rifle violently triggered intense, highly elevated heart rates and profound, gripping anxiety. They acutely understood that if the deeply suspicious Ottoman defenders suddenly realized the massive, completely unprecedented deception and launched a massive, coordinated assault, the small, deeply isolated Australian contingent would be utterly, immediately annihilated without any possible reinforcement. On his final, incredibly somber day occupying the freezing, blood-soaked Gallipoli Peninsula, Sergeant Miller quietly walked through the small, hastily arranged cemetery located directly behind his devastated trench. He stared deeply at the seemingly endless, highly symmetrical rows of crude, wooden crosses, each marking the final, deeply tragic resting place of a young, exceptionally brave Australian soldier. He softly read the deeply familiar names of the courageous, deeply loyal men he had personally trained, fought beside, and tragically lost in the horrific, completely futile slaughter. The immense, truly staggering cost of the campaign weighed heavily upon him. At precisely 1:30 in the morning on the final, incredibly tense day of the massive operation, Sergeant Miller officially received the highly anticipated, deeply significant order to immediately fall back. He firmly checked the sophisticated, cleverly rigged drip rifles one absolutely final time, ensuring the crucial, completely deceptive mechanisms were actively ticking down toward their designated, highly staggered firing times. With a final, deeply emotional glance toward the dark, heavily occupied enemy lines, he silently led his small, deeply exhausted squad out of the freezing, thoroughly pulverized dirt that had violently claimed so many of their brothers. The agonizing, completely silent march down the steep, heavily shadowed ravines toward the waiting, completely darkened evacuation boats was arguably the most terrifying, deeply nerve-wracking experience of the entire deployment. Every single cautious step through the frozen, heavily cratered mud felt incredibly loud, threatening to instantly alert the deeply suspicious Ottoman sentries to their massive, highly vulnerable retreat. The men held their collective, highly anxious breath, desperately expecting the terrifying, deeply familiar roar of enemy artillery to suddenly shatter the unnatural, completely fragile silence, encompassing the deserted, highly treacherous coastal landscape. The fiercely dedicated rearguard finally reached the completely darkened, heavily congested shoreline, hastily scrambling aboard the small, highly vulnerable wooden landing craft, waiting quietly in the freezing, shallow surf. As the heavily laden boats immediately pulled away from the deeply contested beachhead, the completely silent, highly exhausted Australian soldiers stared continuously back at the massive, thoroughly imposing silhouette of the rugged peninsula. Only the occasional, highly irregular crack of their cleverly engineered drip rifles echoed across the dark, freezing water, brilliantly maintaining the crucial, massive deception until the entire, deeply battered fleet safely sailed away. The brilliant, flawlessly executed military evacuation was a spectacular, completely unprecedented logistical success, definitively resulting in practically zero additional casualties for the deeply battered, highly exhausted Allied expeditionary force. The deeply confused, highly cautious Ottoman defenders did not fully realize the massive, completely comprehensive withdrawal until well after the sun had fully risen over the totally abandoned, completely silent trenches. They cautiously crept forward into the deserted, highly sophisticated defensive network, completely bewildered by the brilliant, deeply elaborate deception that had flawlessly masked the massive, highly coordinated departure of the entire, thoroughly entrenched invading army. The bloody, completely disastrous 8-month military campaign on the rugged, highly unforgiving Gallipoli Peninsula was an unmitigated, completely undeniable strategic defeat for the vast, highly powerful British Empire. The overarching, immensely ambitious objective of successfully capturing the deeply fortified Ottoman capital and decisively opening a vital, highly strategic maritime route to Russia had comprehensively, thoroughly failed. Over 8,000 young, incredibly brave Australian soldiers had tragically perished in the horrific, completely stalemated meat grinder, with completely staggering numbers of heavily traumatized, deeply wounded veterans bearing the permanent, completely visible physical and psychological scars of the horrific conflict. However, from the absolute, profound depths of this horrific, completely mismanaged imperial disaster, a powerful, completely enduring national narrative was brilliantly, permanently forged in the pulverized, heavily blood-soaked dirt. The deeply unified, completely unshakable performance of the newly formed Australian military on the brutally contested global stage immediately garnered profound, deeply respectful international recognition and immense, truly significant domestic pride. They had spectacularly, undeniably demonstrated a unique, highly resilient national character, absolutely defined by profound courage, unyielding endurance, and fiercely egalitarian mateship in the face of absolute, catastrophic command incompetence and horrific, completely mechanized slaughter. This profound, deeply ingrained conceptualization of the highly dedicated, incredibly loyal citizen soldier fundamentally, permanently transformed the overarching, deeply foundational core of the modern Australian national identity. The legendary, highly revered Anzac ethos entirely transcended the immediate, thoroughly undeniable reality of the massive, completely catastrophic tactical defeat, elevating the profoundly tragic sacrifice of the fallen men into a sacred, deeply unifying national myth. The deeply held, universally respected values displayed by Sergeant Miller and his completely exhausted, thoroughly dedicated comrades became the absolute, uncompromising benchmark for all subsequent generations of the highly disciplined Australian armed forces. The horrific, incredibly costly lessons violently learned upon the steep, deeply scarred cliffs of Anzac Cove permanently, profoundly reshaped the deeply foundational structure of the evolving Australian military doctrine. They fundamentally, completely rejected the rigid, deeply outdated imperial traditions of blind, unquestioning obedience, permanently replacing them with a highly pragmatic, intensely loyal focus on superb, thoroughly dynamic battlefield leadership and unbreakable horizontal camaraderie. The deeply shared, thoroughly traumatic experience of the miserable, highly deadly trench warfare firmly, permanently bound the young, highly ambitious nation together, forging a completely unique, fiercely independent identity through immense, shared suffering. Sergeant Thomas Miller leaned completely exhausted against the cold, heavily vibrating steel railing of the large, completely darkened transport ship, silently watching the rugged, profoundly hostile coastline permanently fade away. He was deeply, undeniably, a permanently changed man, heavily burdened by the immense, truly crushing psychological weight of incredibly profound loss and terrible, completely unforgettable battlefield trauma. Yet, despite the total, completely unmitigated strategic catastrophe, he possessed a deep, incredibly quiet pride in the remarkable, deeply impressive battlefield conduct of his incredibly brave, fiercely loyal men who fought and tragically died in the freezing, heavily pulverized mud. The completely disastrous Gallipoli campaign was definitively over, but the deeply enduring, tremendously powerful legend of the incredibly brave, fiercely loyal Anzac soldier had only just officially begun its legacy. The brutal, heavily mismanaged military expedition spectacularly, completely failed to achieve its primary, deeply ambitious strategic objectives, but it inadvertently, permanently succeeded in birthing a proud, fiercely independent modern nation. The horrific, deeply tragic sacrifice of those incredibly courageous, completely selfless young volunteers permanently, undeniably guaranteed that their deeply respected, thoroughly legendary names would be eternally, perfectly remembered and highly honored throughout all of subsequent Australian history.